So at this point, we have already finished computing and understanding variances for materials and labor. Now at this point, let us proceed with our learning objective number 4, and that is to compute your variable manufacturing overhead rate along with your variable manufacturing efficiency variances. Now, let's go back again to Glacier Peak Outfitters. Pero this time around, let's take a look at the data pertaining to variable manufacturing overhead. So if we look at the data, it's very clear here that the allocation base na ginamit ng Glacier is the direct labor and the computation of its predetermined overhead rate. So the standard quantity that we will use is the same with that of the standard quantity for labor. So the standard quantity is 1.2 standard hours per parka. And how much is our variable manufacturing overhead rate na predetermined rate? That's $4 per hour. And then yung actual data natin is that during the month, last month rather, how many hours were spent sa inyong variable manufacturing overhead to come up with the 2,000 parkas, 2,500. And the company spent a total of $10,500 for its variable manufacturing overhead. So just like labor and materials, I will still use the traditional method in the computation of the variable manufacturing overhead variances. So let's begin with your rate variance. Your rate is computed as follows. You just get the difference between the product of your actual hours multiplied by your actual rate and actual hours multiplied by your standard rate. Or yung shortcut nga natin, you just get the difference between your actual rate and your standard rate. The difference, you multiply that to your actual hours. So, substituting yung mga dapat na, tawag nito, item dyan. So, for actual hours, how many oras yung na-spend? 2,500. The actual rate is 4.20. How was 4.20 computed? It was given earlier that the amount spent for your variable manufacturing overhead is 10.5. So 10.5, how many hours yun? 2.5. So the actual rate must be 4.2. And we know also from the previous slide that the standard rate for your variable manufacturing overhead is only $4. So your actual rate is higher than your standard rate by 20 cents per oras. So 20 cents per oras, multiply mo ng how many oras? 2,500. Thus, we have an unfavorable rate variance of $500. Then we proceed to your efficiency variance. Efficiency, how do we compute that? We just get the difference between your, between your actual hours multiplied by your standard rate and your standard hours multiplied by your standard rate. Or, para ma-shortcut, you just get the difference between your actual na oras less your standard na oras. The difference you multiply to your standard rate. So the actual oras is 2,500. The standard is only 2,400. Again, how was 2,400 computed? You produce 2,000 parkas and then the standard oras per parka is 1.2. So that's a total of 2,400. So if you notice, there are more actual hours than standard hours. More by 100 hours. Multiply that by 4, which is your standard rate. Thus, we have an efficiency variance of 400 unfavorable. And so, just like your materials and labor variances, I will share also to you how to solve your variable manufacturing overhead variances using your factored equations. Ito yung mga sinasabi ko from the previous slide na shortcut. So, kindly go over them and then of course, you will notice that the variances are exactly the same no matter what method you will be using. At this point ngayon, we have already computed 6 or 6 na variances. Dalawa sa materials, dalawa sa labor, and dalawa also sa inyong variable manufacturing overhead. So the question now is, how do you know which variances to investigate? So as a guide, ang sabi dito, larger variances either in dollar amount or as a percentage of the standard are investigated first. So, whether the variance is favorable or unfavorable, hindi nakastate, no? For as long as there is a variance, regardless kung favorable or unfavorable, kailangan pa rin i-investigate. And again, as your guide, ano yung priority ng investigation ninyo? Ang sabi dito, again, larger variances in dollar amount or as a percentage of the standard are investigated first. Para malaman mo rin kung what variances to investigate, you can also use a statistical control chart. So, paano ba gamitin ito? Say, for example, meron kang desired value. Normally naman talaga yung desired value natin, 0. Ma'am, what do you mean 0? Wala tayong gustong variance. So, 0. So, hindi siya favorable, hindi rin siya unfavorable. So, pwede starting point natin 0 as our desired value. And then, pwede tayo magkaroon ng policy na plus 500 minus 500. So, anong ibig sabihin ng plus 500 minus 500? Plus 500 meaning up to 500 na favorable limit and minus 500 ibig sabihin up to 500 rin na unfavorable limit. So, pag yung variance mo lumampas dun sa 500, regardless whether favorable or unfavorable, kailangan mo na siyang i-investigate. The following are the advantages of using standard costing. So kindly go over them. For more detailed explanation, it's either self-explanatory na sila or kung medyo confused ka pa rin, please refer to your book. So kung may advantages, of course, meron ding disadvantages or potential problems. So kindly go over kung ano mga yon. Now, let's proceed to our fifth learning objective. So, appendix na ito, hindi na ito kasama ng main text. And your fifth learning objective is to compute and interpret your fixed overhead budget and volume variances. So, at this point, we are already done with all the variable costs. Those are labor, material, and variable overhead. So, we were able to compute and interpret their variances already. So, at this point, our focus now is computation ng variances for fixed manufacturing overhead. One variance for your fixed overhead is what we call your budget variance. So how do we compute for the budget variance? Very easy lang yan. You just have to get the difference between your actual fixed overhead and your budgeted fixed overhead. The difference is now your budget variance. The other fixed overhead variance is what we call your volume variance. So how do we compute for that volume variance? We just have to get the difference between your budgeted fixed overhead and your fixed overhead applied. The difference is your volume variance. The volume variance can also be computed by multiplying your fixed portion of your predetermined overhead rate by the difference between your denominator hours and your standard hours. Now, let's try computing fixed overhead variances by using itong data for Cola Company. So, you have the production and machine hour data for a particular period. So, just go over the given data. In this slide naman, we can see yung production overhead cost ng Cola Company. So, before we solve for the volume and your budget variance, solve muna natin itong ating predetermined overhead rates. So, the predetermined overhead rate for Cola Company, ang kanyang allocation base is machine hour. So, as we can see in the slide, the POH niya is $4 per machine hour. Inuna natin compute yung POH na nyo so that it will be easier to solve for the different fixed overhead variances later on. The $4 per machine hour that we computed from the previous slide is your total predetermined overhead rate. So if we will break it down into its variable and fixed component, yung variable nun is $1 per machine hour computed as follows. $90,000 divided by 90,000 machine hours. And then for the fixed component, that will be 270,000 divided by 90,000 machine hours. Saan galing ito? From the given dun sa earlier slides. So, ang breakdown ng $4 per machine hour is $1 for your variable component and then $3 for your fixed component. Yung kakailanganin natin in this part of the lecture is yung fixed component kasi nga we are talking now of your fixed overhead variances. So using the given sa problem na ito, let's try to compute for the budget variance ng Cola Company. So the actual fixed overhead, if balikan nyo yung given, is 280,000 while Cola Company budgeted fixed overhead at 270. So if you compare actual with what is budgeted, actual is higher by 10,000. That is why our budget variance is unfavorable. Hindi rin mahirap i-remember itong variance na to because may clue ka na budget variance. So all you have to do is compare the actual fixed overhead with what you have budgeted. At this point, let's compute for your volume variance. How do we compute for volume variance? All you have to do is get the difference between your budgeted fixed overhead less your fixed overhead applied to work in process. So we know already your budgeted fixed overhead. It was already given at 270,000. Or if hindi agad siya automatically given, all you have to do is get lang yung budgeted hours, multiply mo lang sa kanyang budgeted hours multiplied mo lang sa kanyang standard rate. Now, ang question is, ma'am, how did you compute the 84,000 machine hour as your standard machine hours? Kung balikan nyo yung previous slides, yung binigay yung mga given, you will see there that the number of units actually produced is 28,000 and the number of hours allowed based on our budget for each unit na natapos is 3 hours. So when you multiply 28,000 by 3 hours, you get 84,000. So, ma'am, are you telling us that the 84,000 is our standard hours? The answer is yes. Again, if you kung balikan yung mga yung earlier slides dito, the computation for your fixed overhead applied is yung standard hours multiplied by your standard rate. Now, if itong formula na to, itong formula ng volume variance, pwede mo siyang i-shortcut. Paano i-shortcut yan? Or depende sa given. Pwede mo rin ma-solve ito siya by getting the difference ng inyong budgeted hours with your standard hours. Again, standard hours, ito yung inallow mo na oras for the number of units na na-complete. Gaano ba kalaki yung standard hours? Sorry, gaano ba kalaki yung budgeted hours natin? Kung balikan nyo yung previous slide, makita nyo doon that the budgeted hours is 90,000 for this period. When you adjust that to your standard hours, dapat 84 lang yung nagamit mo. Ma'am, bakit nga ulit 84 lang dapat yung nagamit ko? Because you produced only 28,000 units and then yung budgeted oras mo for each unit na natapos is 3. So again, 28,000, multiply that by 3, you get 84,000. So 90 less 84, that's 6,000. And then the same kasi sila ng multiplier dito, your machine hour per unit na standard. In this case, that is how much? 3. Or yung inyong predetermined overhead rate. Diba for the fixed overhead, yung na-compute natin earlier, the predetermined overhead rate is 3. So when you multiply 6,000 hours by 3, you get 18,000. Unfavorable. Now, ma'am, why is this unfavorable? This is unfavorable because what you have, um, this is unfavorable because mas malaki kasi yung tawag nito. When you multiply 84,000 hours, multiply that by 3, you get 252,000 hours. So the fixed overhead applied is only 252, while your budgeted fixed overhead is 270. So budgeted is higher than your fixed overhead applied. That's why your variance is unfavorable. So that's it. That's how you compute for your volume variance. In this slide, we can see a pictorial view of the variances for your fixed overhead lang ha, na variances. So in a way, parang na siyang summary of your two variances for fixed overhead. Makita natin dito that with regards to budget variance, that is unfavorable by 10, and then your volume variance, still an unfavorable variance at 18,000. So that gives us a total variance of 28,000 unfavorable. At this point, let's reconcile your overhead variances with any under-applied or over-applied overhead. So in a standard cost system, the sum of your overhead variances equals the under or over-applied overhead cost for the period. If you have an unfavorable variance, this is equivalent to under-applied overhead. Favorable variances naman, on the other hand, are equivalent to over-applied overhead. So, take note of that ha. Pag favorable, over-applied. Pag unfavorable, under-applied. So, let's see if si Cola Company, meron ba siyang overhead meron ba siyang over-applied or under-applied overhead for the period. Now, if you will recall, yung predetermined overhead rate that we computed earlier is at $4 per unit. Total predetermined overhead rate. Kasi kung fixed lang yan, that should be 3. And then the standard hours allowed is 84,000 hours. Again, paano na-compute yung 84,000? If you recall, nakapag-produce ka ng 28,000 units and then yung allowed lang na oras per finished unit is 3 hours per unit. So, $4 per machine hour, you multiply that with your standard hours allowed. Your manufacturing overhead applied for the period is 336. When we compare your manufacturing overhead applied with the actual manufacturing overhead spent during the period, that's 380. So we have a 44,000 na under-applied. Why is it under-applied? Because how much lang yung na-applied na nyo sa work in process? Only 336,000. and you actually spend 380 for your manufacturing overhead. So that gives us a 44,000 under applied. Now, before we reconcile any variances with over or under applied na overhead for Cola Company, let's compute muna for the variable overhead variances kasi na-compute na natin yung fixed overhead variances para ma-fully reconcile talaga natin yung variances with any over or under applied ng overhead. Sorry, for Cola Company, na-determine na pala natin that it is under applied. So, let's compute for the variable overhead variances. Now, if you recall, for variable overhead variances, dalawa yan. You have your rate and you have your efficiency. So, for the rate, as computed using the formula actual hours multiplied by the difference by your actual rate and your standard rate, we get a rate variance of 12,000 unfavorable. Efficiency variance naman for your variable overhead is at 4,000 unfavorable. Computed as follows. You just get the difference between your actual hours and your standard hours, and you multiply that by your standard rate. The standard rate is your predetermined overhead rate. So that gives us an efficiency variance of $4,000 unfavorable. So dalawang unfavorable yan. So we will add to get your total variance of 16,000. So 12,000 unfavorable for rate and another 4,000 unfavorable coming from your efficiency. That gives us a total variable overhead variance of 16,000 unfavorable. So, ayan, nandyan na lahat ng variances for your overhead. Variable overhead rate is $12 unfavorable. Variable overhead efficiency, $4,000 unfavorable. And the fixed overhead variances, budget and volume that we computed earlier, 10,000 and 18,000, puro unfavorable. So, since puro unfavorable, what we will do, just simply add to get your total overhead variance. And if you notice, your total overhead variance equals the amount of under applied ng overhead. So, with that, we were able to reconcile now your variances with any over applied or under applied overhead for the period. So, that ends our discussion for standard costing. If you have any clarifications, raise them during our synchronous discussion, or you can email me, you can message me, or if you want, we can have a small group discussion. So just let me know kung if meron kayong questions, clarifications. So that's it. I will see you on Friday for our synchronous discussions, and then as always, ingat kayo parate. Namimiss ko na yung iba sa inyo kasi hindi uma-attend ng synchronous discussion natin. So, I'm hoping that this Friday, I get to see more of you. Pero kung hindi man, so I hope you're making use of your time wisely rin naman. So, I wish you always the best, and then I wish you well. I wish that you are always safe. So, ingat kayo parate. For those who will be able to join the synchronous discussion, I'll see you all on Friday. God bless everyone. God bless din sa akin. God bless sa atin lahat.